has happened since the first one. We met up in November, and since then, pretty much every device has a motion controller of some type. We could have said that in November. Carmel is gathering a lot of speed. The A-frame API is up to 4.0 now. That includes support for motion controllers. The immersive hackathon in Sydney has happened. 56 release of Chrome VR support. Everything is starting to really heat up, and this is getting quite exciting. And I'm glad so many people share my excitement. Excitement! So a bit of housekeeping first up. We once again have Web Directions to thank for giving us the use of their premises. If you haven't been here before, the bathrooms are down the hall. Cold beverages are at the back. There are probably fire escapes somewhere. Boomworks are once again recording 360 video for those who couldn't make it or those who want to rewatch this video later. Oh, hi Dave.
Who's the king?
He's there. And we once again have all you guys to thank for coming along. So we've got two talks tonight. First up, Patrick's going to show us through some APIs for WebVR, and then we're going to have Alex taking us to the world of artificial intelligence in So enough of this. Let's get the first of our speakers up. Patrick.
Sure.
You can clap for him.
WebVR stuff before. If you haven't, don't worry, I'm actually talking about something different than what I often talk about, because you guys already had a meetup last time. How many people were at the last one? Before. So those who were there before already had a bit of an explanation of WebVR and A-frame and all the cool stuff. So I'm not going to go into those basics, but I'll kind of revise like little bits and pieces. My main thing is going to show you a bit more beyond that, giving you some ideas on how you can actually take advantage of the joy that is WebVR to do some very neat things. So yeah, I am at that Patrick guy on Twitter, and my DMs are open, so you can message me whenever you want with questions, tweet at me and tell me how terrible the presentation is, and overall just kind of keep in touch with what I'm doing. If you want random kind of tweets about VR and what's going on, I'm usually doing that sort of stuff. Overall, I'm here because I spend my life at the moment trying to help other developers like you guys. How many people actually like developer types? Raise your hands. And how many people sort of like designery sorts instead? Cool. You can all still do WebVR stuff, as I'm sure many of you already realized. So this works for all of you. But I'm here to try and help all of those sorts get involved in emerging tech. So things like VR, but many other stuff too. I run a site called DevDiner, where I cover things like VR, AR, wearables, smartwatches, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and robotics. So I cover a bunch of stuff, and a lot of what I do is interviewing people who are in this space already who are doing cool stuff to try and get their ideas and their experience and tell them, tell us what you did and what you did wrong so that we all don't go through the same issues. I've also got a weekly newsletter where I send out links to important stuff around the web that's kind of happened. If you imagine the number of different tech blogs and websites and every individual blog that every new startup has for its own announcements, I kind of just grab all of those things, filter it down to like just what the main important stuff is, and then have quick one-liners, kind of this happened, this happened, this happened, to help people catch up. And overall, I'm here trying to tell people, make the leap into emerging tech. You guys don't need to be told because you're already here looking at emerging tech stuff. But it's fun, and it's totally worth trying. So, where are we the first half of 2016 alone saw $1.3 billion invested in VR. And that was just half a year last year, and it hasn't really slowed down since then. Surprisingly, it keeps getting bigger and bigger. And the joy is that with VR, you can create entire worlds from your imagination. And ones which don't have to stick to the same rules that the current world has. So you could very much make something which defies gravity and have people explore what it's like to defy gravity. You could make something where people can fly. But even really strange random things, like one of my favorite VR apps was built several years ago, and it was by a guy who, with the old Oculus, set up an app where every time you change and look somewhere else in the scene, it progresses the VR experience along. So you kind of look at a pot plant, you look away, then when you look back, the pot plant's different. And slowly over time, the entire world around you keeps changing the more you look around. It's really trippy and exciting at the same time. And that was a really good way of, I guess, when I show those demos and things, and when I go around to different events, it's the best way I can show for people to say, that isn't something that would ever be possible in the real world. But because in VR, you control everything about everything, you can put people in situations they'd never be in before. For you guys, you get to do with JavaScript and web stuff. And for a lot of web developers out there and designers, that sort of stuff hasn't really been possible. We've had really simple kind of, we could make web pages, and the web pages were cool, but you've never really been able to take people into a web page. You couldn't be like, don't look at anything else right now apart from what I want to show you. Whereas now, you can. So why WebVR is wonderful is you get to use all the skills you've already got. So if you're a web developer, you can already use HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But even if you're not great at JavaScript, how many people hate JavaScript? That's how I know I can write that. So
he's the only honest one.
Even if you don't like JavaScript and you don't want to admit that, say, you're not quite great at JavaScript and you try and just kind of make stuff up as you go and hope that it actually sticks together by the end and nobody notices, that is fine. A lot of the WebVR stuff you can do without needing to worry about any of that. That stuff's already taken care of with A-Frame and other frameworks out there. You don't have the app install, so one of the most irritating things with building for VR with Unity and Unreal Engine and all those is that you kind of, to get it to people, you usually need to get it onto an app store. You have to get it onto the iOS app store, or you have to get it onto the Android Play Store, or you've got to get it onto Steam, or the Oculus Store, and all those things. And every store has its own kind of standards for, you know, your app needs to be able to do this, or it has to be able to do that. So there are issues around, say, when you're building for, I think it was Oculus. Oculus get upset if you've got components that are to do with other VR headsets. So you literally, while you can build one VR app that works for everything, you then have to appease all the different groups and say, oh, before I submit it to Oculus, I have to make sure I take all the other stuff out first because others will get upset at me. So with WebVR, you don't have to care. You skip them all completely, which is a lovely feeling. So no drama, you just kind of say, here's the URL, just go to it, and it is there. You don't have to go through anybody, no middleman. And so you get to distribute everything direct to the people you want to get it to, which saves a lot of time. It's also really good because it's headset agnostic. So you don't have to say, I'm building specifically for the Oculus Rift. You just say, I'm building a VR application on the web, and it'll adapt for everybody. And kind of, you can add little bits of features for the specific headsets, like if they're on the Vive, you can set up controllers and things for them. But you don't have to be too specific in what you're building. It kind of is a lot more generic for everything, which is good. So there are tons of ways to get involved in WebVR. I don't know how much people covered before, but you could do WebGL coding from scratch. How many people are doing WebGL stuff from scratch? Cool. Good luck. I won't be, and we'll avoid that as much as humanly possible. Then it kind of progressed from there, and a lot of people in the early days, this was about maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3, we were building it using 3GS and device orientation events, which was basically you could track the gyro in phone, and you kind of simulated being like following your gaze, but it wasn't perfect. So it was a bit disorienting, and you kind of like looked around the room, and you had it like kind of covering your face. When you took it off, you weren't really in the same spot that you were at the start. But that's kind of what a lot of the newer WebVR stuff is based off. It still kind of hooks into this, just a bit more advanced. But there is an easier way now, which you guys already know about, which is A-Frame. How many people have tried A-Frame by this point in the room? Cool. How many people plan on trying A-Frame soon? Cool. There's So this is a really good way of building more collaborative stuff. So imagine if you wanted to build a interactive boardroom where you could say, hey everybody, here's the URL, just go to this URL and we're going to be in VR just sitting together in a boardroom and chatting. And it's really good for that. My favorite thing that the creator did with this was he also made live coding inside it. So you could code in JavaScript in the virtual world and code out your world in your world, which is kind of strange at the same time, but fun. So you could be like, hey, create a cube, create like 100 cubes with a loop, and then suddenly all these cubes start appearing around you. So that sort of side of things is quite cool. And then there's also React VR, which is from Facebook and Oculus. That's their new approach. It is still relatively new, so if you're really unsure of what to start with, I wouldn't recommend trying the React stuff yet because there's not as much documentation for it. I would recommend just go with A-Frame because there are tons and tons of existing projects out there. People have built like a whole heap with it, so there's a lot more to kind of go and work off and compare than there is with React. But if you're really good at React, you can kind of give it a go with the caveat that you might get stuck with very little actual assistance to kind of help you along the rest of the way. Cool. So all of these have one advantage that I didn't mention at all on purpose, which is they can all access web APIs. So most people here, if you've worked in the web space before, you will have some idea of what a web API is. But if you don't, I'm going to explain it. Basically, this whole idea is actually really big, but not a lot of people are thinking about it yet, because up until now, the WebVR space has still been based on, we're all trying to work out how to get it to work on all the different devices, and we're all kind of working on the technical side of things, of making it actually just work and display and get developers to try it. But we're beyond that point now. We've got people trying it. And the exciting thing is using web APIs. So, what is an API? For anybody who isn't sure and doesn't want to kind of openly say they have no idea what I'm talking about, APIs are basically rules that govern how one application can talk to another application. That's the simplest form of how I could explain it. But in terms of web APIs, it's sort of like opening up a tunnel from one web application to another. So an example would be Twitter API. There are tons of web sites and web apps and stuff that use Twitter API to say display a tweet. They do that because Twitter gives an open API where they say, here is a set of commands that you can use to say, give me tweets from this user. And so that's kind of what a web API is in general. There are tons of them out there. And the reason that they're exciting for this case is that using web APIs, you can repurpose information and bring it into completely different uses that the people who originally built this thing didn't actually think of. So Twitter, while they may be starting to get into VR, and they kind of are without actually saying what they're doing, when they built Twitter, they didn't think, let's build something which is ready for VR. They just thought, we're going to build a service where people can tweet out 140 characters about their breakfast, which then evolved into something actually useful. But with the whole idea between WebVR, because you can hook into other APIs, you can start bringing that stuff in and find new ways of, say, using Twitter information or using all sorts of other information that already exists. So, and it makes it a lot faster as well. So when you're building something that works on a web API, you can just set up really basic rules and then just have the rest of it populated by other data that you're getting from somewhere else. So imagine if you bring any information whatsoever that already exists on the web, that hasn't been visualized in a sort of more exciting way before, into a completely new immersive world, where literally somebody's standing here and you're generating a world around them based on existing data that's out there for some reason. And don't worry if this makes no sense, I'm going to show you tons of examples. Cool, so how do we do this? This is an early one that I did a while ago. I think it's about 2-3 years ago. Let's see whether it actually works, because it relies on an API which kind of times out every now and then. But what it is it hooks into the weather, and it takes the weather from different locations, and gets the wind speed, it gets the actual name of the location. So I think the actual weather API literally just gives you a postcode or something, and I kind of have to convert it to see whether it's actually working. This is the one demo which is prone to like not work. There it is, because it's old. That's okay. I'll show an example later. But if it theoretically works, those globes that you see, the like glowing balls, will kind of spin around you depending on the direction of the wind. So if the wind's going kind of southeast, then it kind of spins in one direction. If it's going the other direction, it spins the other way. And the globes change color depending on the weather. So if it is cloudy, then they're more white, like you see there. If it's sunny, then they're more kind of a light blue color. And it kind of gives a visualization of a few different locations around the world, and you kind of get a feel for what the weather is like there. This is a really simple example of bringing in Web API stuff. And I mainly did this as an example in an article I wrote a while ago trying to teach people how to do VR stuff in JavaScript. And it was like another simpler example. Let's see what we can go across. I found the floor in this system. Okay. So, one that will work, which is also pre-WebVR. And so when I say pre-WebVR, I mean this is using just the FreeJS and the device orientation event. So if you actually put this on your phone, it wouldn't completely track you perfectly, but it's more examples of using API data. So this one is an example of using Twitter. And what I did is I have it hooked into a certain keyword. So in this case, it's looking for the keyword of pizza. And each of these towers is a tweet about pizza, and the towers are different lengths depending on how long the person's tweet was about pizza. Why pizza, you ask, is actually a very specific term that I chose because browsers and stuff, especially when I was building this 2 years ago, still weren't ready for like tons and tons of information. So if I chose a really common phrase that people tweet about a lot, like Justin Bieber or these days Donald Trump, then the application would break very quickly because it just would throw too many things up and eventually it just freaks out and goes, too much stuff, I can't handle this, and collapses. But if you find a keyword that's not quite as frequently tweeted about, then you kind of don't get anything and it looks really boring. It turns out pizza is relatively frequently tweeted about around the world, but not so frequently that it breaks the app. And so this is kind of a really random example, but I always found it kind of fun to make like random glowing bulbs that respond to different events that are happening around the world. So you could change this for all sorts of different information. Just to kind of display it in a different way. But these days, as I was kind of telling you guys as well, is I usually use A-Frame, and I also use Node.js, and there are reasons for that. A-Frame specifically because it's a lot cleaner, and it's a lot more cross-platform. So the first two I showed you there, I couldn't guarantee that that would work on every device. I would have to physically go in, check every single device, and make sure it works. With A-Frame, they do a lot of that for you already, so you just work off their service, and it handles everything for you. And Node.js is actually a really important thing, which I kind of wanted to make sure you all thought of, is when you use web APIs, especially open ones where you have to sign up to be able to use them, they usually give you a specific key that says this is your access, that says you are allowed to use Twitter and pull in data. But you don't want to give other people that key because then they can start using the service on your behalf. And if it's services similar to the web one, which wasn't quite working, that one is limited, so you're only supposed to use it for really infrequent calls. So if I start requesting it more than, say, I think once or twice an hour, then it times out like it did there and says, no, you've used the service too frequently. So if you give out your API keys, or if you put it in a way where people can see it, then they can take that and start using it in their own applications, and suddenly your ones will stop working if they're suddenly spiking your whole limit. So I use Node to have these keys and stuff on the server side, and you wouldn't have to use Node. You could use PHP, you could use Java, you could use any sort of server-side stuff you want. And the whole idea is just so that the calls get done on the server side, and nobody has any chance of finding out what your key was if they wanted to steal what you're doing. The code might be too small there for you guys to see it, I think, on the screen. So let's just, well, that's not helpful. You can see my Twitter and stuff more. Cool. Terrible web development by this person called Patrick. What you'll basically see is it's just a really simple call that basically just replicates what the API was already doing. So I will just show you it in action rather than showing you code. This code is boring. This is what I've made last year, and it's a Meetup visualizer. So it hooks into the Meetup API. So meetup.com, where I'm sure a lot of you have signed up to go to different events like this one. They have an open API where you can find out information about different events. And in this case, I hope this one works. It was working before. What it does is it goes through and gets a specific event and picks up how many RSVPs there were, how many spots were available, and then visualizes it in a wonderful WebVR way. Let's see whether my code server is just breaking. There we go. Okay. And so these are really simple ones, and they're kind of not perfect because I mainly created them to illustrate a point rather than actual web VR thing you'd actually want to make. Is that you can see a whole bunch of chairs, but if you go near the back, there are a whole bunch that are kind of transparent, and so these are the ones that haven't been taken by anybody yet. Whereas these ones are ones where the event has had these seats filled. And the idea was that it will automatically change this depending on which event you give it. So I haven't put it up and said, make this many chairs, this many for everything. It generates that depending on which event I put into it. So if there was an event with only, say, 20 spots, there'd be much less chairs there, and it'd be way less exciting. I also wanted to advance this and have like a window that was like up here, which showed the waiting list, and so with people waiting outside, but I haven't done that yet. And so that was one example. Another thing that I created, I called Into the Web. It's not really public yet. I've just kind of used it as an example of a bunch of conferences and talks I've given, which goes through and reads any website. Within reason, there are a bunch that don't work quite well because of their using HTTPS and kind of blocking a lot of what would be possible. But it reads a website and then generates a world based on that website. Really simple world. It just has a castle, and things will change color depending on what the color scheme it found on the website was. So if I go to Magazine, which is a wonderful site, and I'll speed it up by making it load locally maybe. I'll show the background of what's going on behind it. So it kind of goes through, I don't know if you guys can see that, it's quite super, super small. But it goes through and finds all the different images that are on the page. You can kind of really vaguely see it. Downloads them all, saves them all on the server. It takes a screenshot of the actual web page itself and then grabs what the most frequent colors are on the web page. And then once it's done all that, it generates this world where if you pop out, there's a castle, and then it's kind of got a whole bunch of the images that came up on that web page spinning around, and the castle and stuff is all changing color depending on the website itself. This alone has changed just within the past few hours. I think that some of the images had a few different colors because that castle used to be red and now it is light yellow. But it changes depending on what it sees each time. And so as other examples, make this one load locally. This one here is my fiancée Mary's website. She's a musician and she has a photo page which works very well for this sort of random experience. Let's see whether it's working. No, so it'll work out. And so the whole idea is that it's dynamically generated. So you could take this idea and make it a little more exciting. You could generate trees and things in different places depending on different values. So her website, the background and stuff is a lot of kind of grays. So it's changed the castle to be black. And the images, there are a lot more images on this page. And so the world that it generates is very different. Let's see what this one looks like. So there's another final example. If I go to the Dev Diner website, because this has a totally different color scheme,